Hello everyone, my name is Mike and welcome back to the YouTube channel. So today we're continuing with Sabaton week and this time we're having a look at Sabaton's Bismarck. Hope you enjoy. So as we always do, the link to the original video will be in the description. So Bismarck, so this can mean really one of two things. This can either be Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor, or it means the Bismarck in the battleship. Given the intro here is kind of this coastal area with a ship in the distance, I would imagine it will be the Bismarck, whose famous battleship during the Second World War, probably one of the most famous naval engagements in the Second World War, behind kind of Midway and the Battle on the Coral Sea and stuff like that. And yeah, so I don't want to speak too much because again, I don't know what the song's content is included, and as always, we'll listen through the video and where I can kind of fit in bits of information in between the verses and the choruses, then that's what I'll try and do. So without further ado, subtitles on, and let's get into it. Modern looking cars.
Which blew up the mighty battle cruiser Hood.
The signal comes by wireless and has spotted the plane Bismarck.
So apologies on pausing it that early, but I just wanted to talk about the radio there. I said the German battleship had sunken the Hood, and HMS Hood was a battle cruiser, a British battle cruiser made during the First World War, and in a lot of sense it was kind of almost like the pride of the fleet, a kind of flagship, this kind of symbol of the power and might of the Royal Navy. And when the HMS Hood actually went up, it was kind of a culture shock kind of through the British kind of public, because as the song goes, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, and the whole image that Britain's dominance at sea was somehow threatened when the Hood went up at the hands of the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen. That was a massive shockwave through kind of both British government, British Admiralty and the British public. And that's why kind of the hunt for the Bismarck, I think as well to an extent, has been as dramatised and as kind of built up as much as it had in comparison to some of the other naval engagements in the war. But yeah, just a little tip back. Let's get back to the video.
So, did you find the boat?
Okay, so I think that's the end of the first verse and chorus. So as those of you who might know German, the Kriegsmarine is essentially the German Navy. And yeah, so the Bismarck was one of two ships of the Bismarck class battleship, with the sister also being quite famous in the Tirpitz, later sunk as well by several, and I mean several, I think it was like 6 or 7 RAF missions carrying like Grand Slam bombs, which is like 2,000-pound bombs, like bunker busters, where it sunk around like Norwegian forts. But the Bismarck there, you saw it firing on shipping, and I don't know if it was a specific ship that was supposed to be in frame in that video, or whether they're just doing aesthetics. Because I mean, I'm just saying that ship, or that shot when the ship came out of the mist, that was pretty cool. But entirely, the whole idea of Bismarck was to raid Allied shipping, kind of be a surface raider. Allied shipping in the Atlantic, and that's what its last voyage was. Alongside the Bismarck went out with the cruiser Prince Eugen to raid Allied ship in the Atlantic, and that's when, I said previously, that's when they met a number of different ships, Prince of Wales and HMS Hood, and that's when Hood went up and Prince of Wales got injured, got damaged. It's not a person. And yeah, so after this initial exchange, actually no, I'm going to stop myself there, because the video might actually talk about what happened afterwards. And there was this big hunt for the Bismarck between the Royal Navy and trying to hunt it down before it reached safe waters. So I'm going to stop myself there and see what Sabaton say, and if they don't cover it, I'll fill you guys in.
250,000 tons of steel set the course for the Atlantic with the Allies on the hill. Firepower, firefight. Battle stations keep the targets steady in sight. Into coordination, the hunt has begun. Death and damnation. The fleet is coming. He will lead to rule the waves across the 7 seas. To lead the war machine, to rule the waves and lead the Kriegsmarine. The terror of the seas, the Bismarck and the Kriegsmarine.
Okay, so sorry, just there. I don't know if you noticed as well. I'm just going to skip back a little bit just to talk about these things. So yeah, so the video is kind of almost following what happened. So after, as I said, Prince Eugen met with Hood and the Prince of Wales, after the exchange and stuff, there was some damaging, and Prince Eugen was first forced to kind of depart. And the Bismarck was attempting to essentially loop around, and it lost the Royal Navy, because after the Hood sunk, as I said, it sent that shockwave through the British public, and there was a real zeitgeist to essentially just be like, well, no, we can't allow this to happen. The Royal Navy is dominant at sea, particularly around our own waters. And so basically it was a priority that every ship available in the area, the home fleet and stuff like that, was kind of called up to hunt down the Bismarck and avenge the Hood, and make it so that this menace of the ocean, which the Bismarck was, couldn't be allowed to stand. And so the Bismarck's captain, I forgot his name now, and it's really annoying me, essentially realised this, and he attempted to make port in northern France, where as long as he could get relatively close to the coast, he could be covered by the Luftwaffe and have some semblance of protection, because obviously the Royal Navy wouldn't go too close to the French coast, because otherwise they'd be torn to pieces by German air power. So as it's travelling away, I'm smiling again. I believe this to be HMS Ark Royal, and Ark Royal is one of my favourite ships during the Second World War, and it was an aircraft carrier. It was also part of the deception which led to the German captain scuppering the Graf Spee after the Battle of River Plate as well. Just its name being mentioned in the area led to this. and it was led there. And the reason why I started smiling rather, is this magnificent machine here is a fairy swordfish, and it was a biplane, and it was essentially considered obsolete. It was a biplane that carried a torpedo underneath it, and these some sorties flew from HMS Ark Royal after being spotted by a PBY Catalina, and they was able to land 2 hits of torpedoes on the Bismarck, which is what we saw, and what we saw in the video. And one of these kind of caused superficial damage, but one of them, and the critical blow, hit the Bismarck steering, hit the rudders, and this essentially meant the Bismarck was dead in the water. It couldn't steer properly. And what you saw here, where the fairy swordfish are kind of flying at the Bismarck and the flax going all around it and stuff like this, and because one of the things is, because the swordfish was a biplane, it was significantly slower than kind of modern planes of the day and stuff like this. And there's a great video that I've actually watched in the past by I think it's Air History or Aviation History Visualized. I will try and link it if I can remember the exact video in the description. But essentially, the Bismarck's guns, its anti-aircraft guns, were not kind of synced up properly, and so essentially, by virtue of how obsolete the swordfish was supposed to be, it meant that it was almost kind of invulnerable to the Bismarck's countermeasures, and this allowed it to carry out the critical strike that it did. And once the Bismarck was, its rudders had been kind of stopped, it couldn't really steer properly, then it was just a matter of time until the Royal Navy, which I think it said the fleet is on its way, in the lyrics, essentially was just converging on the Bismarck. And as we saw, let's get back up to where we was. So there's the exchange. You had a number of different ships, number of British battleships rather. HMS Rodney as well, I know, was definitely one of them. I don't know if the Prince of Wales was still there. I think Prince of Wales might have had to divert. I can't remember the exact ships. But as well as a number of cruisers and a number of destroyers. I think it was, at the end, it was HMS Dorsetshire, I want to say. I might be wrong. If I am wrong, I'll try and correct myself. Which was the one that led or kind of carried out the decisive blow with a torpedo. But yeah, that's enough. Let's see where we go from here. So the Bismarck is immobilised. It's been battered by... And when I say battered, I mean battered. I think something they said was like thousands of shells was hitting the Bismarck or fired at the Bismarck in a barrage that essentially lasted several hours. I can only imagine what the crew must have felt like, because as it said as well, I think Bismarck set sail with around 2,200-ish crew on board, and I can only imagine the terror that must be. I mean, I'm not, despite being an Englishman, I have no great love of the sea. The ocean is quite terrifying to me. And so I can only imagine being on the ocean while having thousands of shells round down at you. I can only imagine the terror of what that must have been like. But let's see where the rest of the video takes us.
At the bottom of the ocean, the depths of the abyss, they are bound by iron and blood. The flagship of the Navy, the terror of the seas, his guns have gone silent at last. settle of the seas, Bismarck and the Kriegsmarine.
Okay, so that was Sabaton's Bismarck, rather. And yeah, so the video is almost quite accurate. Obviously, it skipped out a number of things in that the Bismarck very nearly evaded the Royal Navy if it wasn't for the PBY Catalina. They kind of picked up the oil slill and what's the word? Announced the Bismarck's location to the rest of the Royal Navy. And so yeah, so as the thing showed, the Bismarck started to sink. I think there was a bit of an issue with how she wasn't sinking. I think her crew, a couple of hours into the absolute bombardment, actually triggered the scuppering charges, and even though the scuppering charges went off, the Bismarck wasn't actually sinking, which meant that the crew was essentially still tormented and at the mercy of the British guns, which didn't stop firing until she actually started to, as you see there, like roll over, and the crew abandoned ship. And as you see there, again, it's an important thing to remember is that around this time as well, particularly Allied and German fleets, it was still very customary that if a ship was sunk, that the other ships, although they're on the opposing side, would pick up survivors. This happened with both merchant and warshipping for a large part. It didn't happen. It didn't stop until several years into the war, when I believe an American plane actually bombed a German ship bearing a red cross with survivors of the Allied shipping that they'd been raiding, and it was from that point that an order was given that if a ship was sunk, then survivors would not be picked up. And shortly after this, the Allies kind of put their own version of this into play. So it's an important thing to think. I think it is a massive pet peeve. I think it's in that terrible movie U-571 or something like that, when apparently an American crew captures the Enigma machine, even though that was HMS Bulldog. But getting away from that, but there's a scene in there where essentially that U-571, the U-boat surfaces and guns down all the Allied merchantmen and stuff like that. It's just like, there's only a handful of recorded instances of that ever happening, and generally speaking, the worst thing that can happen to a sailor is, drowning, and so sailors tend to not want to do that. And that's what happened. After the Bismarck went up, several destroyers, I think HMS Dorsetshire, again, if I am correct, was one of those that started picking up survivors, as was I want to say like a South African or a New Zealand destroyer as well, that was also there. Also started picking up survivors. However, they had to depart relatively quickly because the U-boat alarm was sounded as a U-boat was supposed to have been spotted in the area, and they picked up what survivors they could, and they essentially left. And the unfortunate thing with that is, as I said, Bismarck sailed with a crew of around 2,200, and only about 100 actually made it back home. A tremendous loss of life. But in a lot of ways, the sinking of one ship as well completely changed the Germans' attitude to their naval doctrine, essentially. The Tirpitz never really saw meaningful action. And the important thing as well is because the ideology or the idea behind using the Bismarck was as a surface raider, to raid Allied shipping with a capital ship, whether that be cruiser, or in the sense of Prince Eugen, or the battleship Bismarck. And so after this tremendous loss of life and tremendous loss of materials, remember this is a huge amount of materials and manpower that you're putting into one ship. You're just kind of putting all your eggs into one basket, particularly when you account for Germans' relatively lacking naval infrastructure, particularly in comparison to the people that they're fighting. I mean, obviously the Americans haven't instituted the two oceans navy plan yet, but the Royal Navy had been dominant for a long time. And this kind of forced the Germans into not convoy raiding with capital ships, but convoy raiding with U-boats. And as we know now in our timeline, the U-boats proved extremely effective in the early years of the war. The Kriegsmarine themselves called them the happy times for a reason. That's because they wreaked havoc. But eventually, as we know in our timeline as well, technology and counter U-boats became dominant, and that's what brought kind of the German Navy to any regard to an end. So that's been Sabaton's Bismarck. I've hoped you enjoyed this. This one was a bit shorter, I think, because, you know, it's just kind of a cool story. There isn't tons of background for it. But yeah, it is still a cool story. I quite like the tune of this one. I still think, again, my favourite one is still probably Uprising at the moment. Although I did actually really like the chorus of Aces in Exile. But we're going to be continuing Sabaton Week going forward. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.